Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today, for our final video of March, just a handful of days after having covered the book entirely in spoiler talks, and just a couple days before I move on to the next one, we are briefly reviewing Towers of Midnight by basically Brandon Sanderson. I literally just finished the book this morning as of the time of recording this video, and I also just came off of just a few minutes ago having recorded the last diary for the video as well. So forgive me, I haven't actually spent a ton of time making these notes. I just prepared these notes quickly this morning, so there might be some things that aren't necessarily structured as well as, say, my review for The Gathering Storm was. But I also hope that this review is going to be a good bit shorter than The Gathering Storms was, because I think that was like my second longest book review that I've put on the channel. So yeah, in order to avoid that happening again, let's go ahead and jump right into the review for Towers of Midnight, because I do think it had heck of a job to do to follow up on The Gathering Storm, and the question is, did it succeed on it? Let's start off with the good and the ways that it did succeed on following up The Gathering Storm. One of the main things that I do want to shout out about Towers of Midnight that actually was incorrect about my predictions about the book, just given the arc that each of Rand's character, and especially Egwene's character, but White Tower stuff in general, the way that all that stuff went down in The Gathering Storm, I wasn't anticipating seeing very much from either of those plot lines, especially not Rand, in this book. Although I was more or less correct in the sense that there wasn't as much of those plot lines within Towers of Midnight, they weren't focused on quite as heavily, again, particularly Rand. I was correct on that front. There was a little bit more of these storylines in Towers of Midnight than I expected there to be, and that was something that I actually enjoyed quite a bit. I was a little bit sad about moving into Towers of Midnight because I had assumed that each of those storylines would be taking a very massive back seat and basically not appearing in this book, kind of the same way that each of, like, Matt's and Perrin's POVs, for example, more or less didn't exist in The Gathering Storm either. Like, they do have a couple scenes apiece in there, but they're not massive stuff for the most part. They definitely take a back seat there. In Towers of Midnight, I would say that that's still sort of the case, particularly with Rand, but there was still a lot more with those storylines going on than I thought there would be. I loved all of that in The Gathering Storm. Those two things make that one of the best books, if not arguably the best individual book in the series. So yeah, I enjoyed that a lot about Towers of Midnight as well. Rand's plotline, like I have said a couple times already, was definitely a little bit more in the background in this book, but he was still present a lot more, even in that context. Like, he doesn't have very much of his own POV, like there's only a couple of his POVs in the entire book, but he does appear as a presence within a lot of other POVs, and seeing his presence within this book, and especially seeing his presence with regard to his attitude, the way that he has changed following the ending of The Gathering Storm, if you know, you know, being able to compare who he is as a character between these two books was very satisfying to see as a result of all that information. It makes the dynamics of him being amongst the other characters extremely fresh, because there is a completely different dynamic to him as a person that makes those dynamics fresh, and there's also the fact that almost everything of his character in Towers of Midnight is viewed from other characters' POVs, and this happened in some of the other books as well. One of the things that I like so much about The Dragon Reborn is the fact that it is mostly viewing him from outside perspectives. Some of my favorite stuff in, I think it was Path of Daggers, was viewing Rand through Perrin's POV, and Gathering Storm had a handful of really great chapters, with some of those chapters being more effective because of seeing the way that they also were viewed from other characters in some sense as well. So, like, there's a lot of this that makes Rand's storyline work, more so than just actually being in his head. And so Towers of Midnight gets to take that particular strength and run with it. And that's something that I like a lot. On the White Tower side of things as well, there's also a massive loose end following The Gathering Storm that is taken care of here. It is taken care of. It is tied up. It is no longer a loose end. And when I say loose end, that almost sounds like a sort of, retroactive complaint about The Gathering Storm. I want to assure you that it's not actually, because that that book goes through the arc that it needs to when it does, but there is something after the big climactic sequence for the White Tower in Gathering Storm that is like, okay, so there's still something that we need to take care of now. So that's something that is probably still going to appear in Towers of Midnight, even if the White Tower takes a step back. And yeah, I was basically right on that frontier. I can't really say anything more than saying that particular loose end was tied up here, but it was tied up, and I'm very satisfied with how Sanderson was able to continue the White Tower and Rand plot lines in Towers of Midnight following what happened in The Gathering Storm. Another great thing about The Gathering Storm is the fact that it is able to focus on some of the other major storylines in a way that Gathering Storm just did not have time for, and that is notably Matt and Elaine's plot lines. Elaine, of course, did not appear at all in Towers of Midnight, and Matt didn't feature very heavily either. So in general, the Camelin storyline of this book, it comes into bigger picture now, it becomes relevant again, and also gets us in a place ready for the last battle for all those characters, and there's a lot of political moves being made, especially on Elaine's end, that is all really good. There are some aspects of the storyline that I think are slightly messy in some ways. I think that some of what happens in Camelin happens a little bit too early, just because of one of the other storylines. We'll get to that a little bit later. And in some other ways, there's some of this story that actually happens a little bit later than I had anticipated and probably optimally would have liked, such as in Matt's storyline. He has a particular task that he's trying to achieve that doesn't end up really actually being taken care of until like the very end of the book, basically. It takes a while, given that this has been teased since, I don't know, like maybe the halfway point of book 11 or something like that. That's something that is also, a pretty big deal within the few scenes of his that occur in The Gathering Storm. So it just feels like it takes a little bit to eventually get there. So the material is great, but like I said, there are some aspects of the Camelin plotline where some of it happens a little too early, some of it happens a little too late, not necessarily from like an objective measurement per se in some cases, just in terms of how it felt to read. So I like all of it, but the structure of it is a little bit strange. That's all I had to say there, Finally being caught up on these fronts with the narrative is also really great, of course. On that front, the culmination of all of the plot lines in general, I think, is something that Towers of Midnight definitely can say is one of its strengths, because by the last handful of chapters of this book, the last battle's basically starting, actually. Like, A Memory of Light does have a chapter called The Last Battle that is 190 pages by itself within a 900-page book, but realistically speaking, I think that, like, probably the first 800 of those 900 pages in that book are going to be the last battle, just broadly speaking, because there's some stuff that goes on in Towers of Midnight that is like basically already the last battle, depending on how you view it from certain perspectives. And the way that the major storylines come together towards the very end of the book, that really basically put us in a spot like, okay, this is happening like tomorrow, basically, or maybe even today. So it's like a very much A Memory of Light is happening like that type of moment. So that's really cool. Being able to actually have all of that come together in Towers of Midnight is great. It's really satisfying. All the stories actually taking place at the same time in the back half of this book is also really nice. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But yeah, it's all really cool. And more on that point, actually, it's not even just the main characters either where this is super satisfying, even though that is a big part of it. I can also say that there are a lot of side plots related to some of this material that are also great in this way, specifically with regard to the point of the last battle. There's a lot of Borderlands-related plot in this book. Some of it is a little bit more piecemeal, and I guess you could say it's a build-up sort of plotline that's happening there, and the other one is a little bit more of an active resistance plotline that's going on between Etherealde and Lan, and those two storylines going on are, again, really great for like sort of centering the tension of this book as it pertains to the coming of A Memory of Light. That is all also really good stuff. And kind of on that note, the book also has, just because of the way that it utilizes the threat of the last battle, and the fact that this is happening very much imminently, and the fact that you feel this means that Towers of Midnight does in fact have an innate sense of tension that most of the books in the series just really don't. Like I kind of hinted at it earlier with, you know, some of the slog books where like you do have a lot of people mentioning at different times like the last battle is coming type of thing, but it kind of feels like this sort of nascent like it's sort of coming, but like we're just doing our own thing over here. No, that's not a thing anymore. Between Gathering Storm and Towers of Midnight, but especially Towers of Midnight, it's like no, like this is happening, and it's happening pretty much. To say it's happening soon is an understatement. So you actually feel that now, and the tension that just inherently puts into the narrative is really good. Finally, one other thing that I do want to praise Towers of Midnight for is that it revitalizes several side characters from the past of the series, and at this point I should actually be motioning towards the early part of the series, characters and storylines that have not been relevant for a long time or feel like they've otherwise been forgotten, like Gawain, for example. He was in the last book, granted, but he's a better character here, and he actually has a character arc here, which is great. Galad, relatedly, funny enough, actually makes an appearance again for the first time in multiple books. I don't even remember the last time Galad was on the page, but the last time that the White Cloaks in general were relevant was a very long time ago, actually, like probably book 8 or something like that. Like, it has been a minute since the White Cloaks have been actively relevant. They're relevant in this book again, and actually pretty important and utilized to great effect. The Black Tower is properly acknowledged and relevant again within the series in some capacity, not quite the capacity that I was maybe quote-unquote wanting, but I'm actually really happy with what's in here because it kind of builds some promises with regard to that storyline for A Memory of Light that I'm hoping to see some big stuff out of. So like there's a lot of this case of things where, you know, characters or storylines that have been forgotten or underutilized or just haven't been relevant even when they've been on the page are actually being important now. And you can say that for sure even with regard to Perrin's storyline. Even though he is a main character, he is actually useful here. And again, this is something that we shall talk about again a little bit later. But let's talk about some of the ways in which I don't enjoy Towers of Midnight. That's maybe a harsh way to put it. It's not that I don't enjoy Towers of Midnight or that there are ways in which I don't enjoy it per se, but there are a couple things about it that make it notably weaker than The Gathering Storm, for example. One of those things I think is that there are a couple storylines here that are a little bit disjointed. You know, there's a great degree to which, you know, some of these storylines being reutilized and reintroduced into the series is good, and which certain side stories and whatnot are, you know, used to great effect, but there are a couple storylines that are still a little bit more of a question mark. You know, you do have one of those Borderlands storylines that is neither really here nor there. It kind of makes a nice little pacing mechanism sort of between the acts of the book, basically, where you can like start and end a particular act of the book with like Lan's POV, for example, with where he's at now, where he's at now, where he's at now, and then the very end. That one's good. I do like that storyline a lot, but there are a couple other storylines which are a little bit less effectively used in this manner, I guess, if that makes sense. One of those is a particular Forsaken POV who I feel like didn't actually support the rest of the material that she was meant to support in the way that I feel like it should have. Again, we'll kind of hint, well, I don't know if we will actually hint at that. Basically, what I'm saying there is that there's a particular storyline that has some structural issues in Towers of Midnight, and that character is the one around which this Forsaken's POV kind of centers around, sort of, but it's disconnected enough and the timeline problems are enough of a problem that like the storyline isn't, that this particular side POV just isn't really as effectively utilized in the book as I feel like she inherently would have been if the timeline wasn't a problem. So, like, that's a very specific issue to have. There's also Avienda's storyline, which between Gathering Storm and this, and here, the utilization of her storyline, it feels a little bit more like means to an end, obviously building her up so that she's ready to be reintroduced into the main story in A Memory of Light, because she's not really relevant to what's actually happening in this book, but she needed to have some of those scenes actually happen at some point. So like, again, feels like a little bit more means to an end. That's one of those things that you can't really blame on the book specifically, because I had to get some of these characters to some of these points for the very end of the book, and the fact that she's not relevant to the main story isn't necessarily her fault, but it does affect the pacing a little bit in the back half, admittedly, in my opinion. Another random thing that I'm just going to include here in post real quick that I forgot to include in the video notes is that romances are also a little bit weird in Towers of Midnight. There's like a lot of them that get some major development or form of resolution in some sense. I mean, it's really like, I guess there's 3 of them, which for Wheel of Time is a lot, and considering the lack of focus on this element throughout most of the rest of the series, or the way that it usually tends to be, you know, in the background, and also sort of the randomness of a couple of them, gets a little bit odd, I will confess. It is definitely one of the weaker aspects of the book. I didn't mind it a whole ton, but I know that there are a bunch of other people that really are going to mind it. But it's not even all that stuff. I would say that there's actually a little bit of technical things that are noticeable about Towers of Midnight that make it weaker than The Gathering Storm as well. And that is primarily in the actual writing. I don't think that Sanderson's writing is as tight in Towers of Midnight as it is in the previous book. There's a lot of copy edit stuff actually in here that are, I think, maybe the worst that the series has featured up to this point. There are random books and random moments, even amongst Robert Jordan's. Just dropped the entire book there. Even amongst Robert Jordan's output, the things get missed. Like, that's part of writing. Like, if you expect to get every copy edit thing fixed in a book, it's just not going to happen. It's impossible. But that doesn't change the fact that Towers of Midnight has a lot more of this than I think The Gathering Storm did. And funny enough, most of the time it's like repeated words within sentences, where you could tell that a sentence was like structured a particular way, and then they decided to reword it in like the other direction, but one of the words didn't get cut or moved around the right way. So like, you have repeat words and stuff like that. There are probably, I would say, an average of like 1 to 2 sentences every like 5 chapters or so that stick out because of this kind of thing. It's not like it's that big of a deal, but having a more copy edit focused brain, and also being somebody who notices that kind of thing really easily anyway, because I read slow and I read word by word. I tend to sub-vocalize when I read, for example, as opposed to just glazing my eyes over stuff. This kind of thing is a lot more noticeable in Towers of Midnight. So it's clear that the actual, you know, the writing of it wasn't quite as polished as Gathering Storm. And I think that this carries through not just into the prose, but into the dialogue. I think that the dialogue is slightly less authentic in a lot more moments in this book, where certain characters, I wouldn't say that characters don't feel like themselves, but where certain sentences that they say feel more like something that a character in our world today would say, or how they would phrase it, as opposed to the way that some of these characters would actually phrase it. So again, just something where I feel like the actual writing of the book was slightly less polished this time around, and I think that's probably because there was so much work put into trying to structure this thing effectively, that it just kind of fell by the wayside, probably. And that's also, you know, kind of relevant to the next problem with the book, and that is that Perrin's storyline is perhaps a little bit ineffective at times. There are a lot of structural issues with Towers of Midnight, in my opinion. His character arc in specific just happens a little bit too quickly, in my opinion, after several books of effectively nothing going on. There was actually a joke within the book where Perrin and Matt actually interact with each other, and Perrin is actively surprised by how much has happened with Matt in the time since they last talked to one another. And yeah, it felt like that was kind of an implicit jab at the fact that Perrin has had nothing going on basically since the Two Rivers, way back in book 4. So like, he's been basically a useless character. And so a lot of the last handful of books have been like sort of trying to sell this sort of internal character thing that he has going on, this mental block that he needs to get over, this struggle that he has personally that he needs to overcome. And while that does happen in this book, and I actually really like it, I really like his character arc in Towers of Midnight, and I love the fact that he's not useless for once, his arc happens a little bit too quickly in this book, where I feel like there are some of the scenes that happen here that should have been ordered a little bit differently. You know, part of the problem with Perrin's storyline here is because of timeline issues, but also some of it isn't. I do think there is some objective, like, things could have been ordered in a different way to make this more effective, and that is an active critique of the book. But speaking of timeline issues, let's move on to the ugly, because it is relevant to the ugly section from The Gathering Storm, and say that the timeline issues, the split between these two books, is really, really felt in this one, where it's a little bit easier to miss in The Gathering Storm. You know, there is a particular moment in The Gathering Storm where you can kind of look at it and say, wait a minute, there's some stuff that's supposed to happen here that just isn't in this book. Where is that information? But otherwise, the rest of that book on its own is rock solid. Towers of Midnight almost retroactively negatively impacts The Gathering Storm because of how rough some of its structure is, actually. That is how rough this gets in some places. Like I said, The Gathering Storm on its own is a fantastic book, but Towers of Midnight struggles in its own arc at times because of its structure. It's obvious that a lot of this was kind of going to be inherent to the book on account of the way that some certain storylines were split up. This is something that I talked about in The Gathering Storm. It's like, I'm willing to forgive The Gathering Storm this problem because it's obvious that this was written as one book, but obviously was too long to be one book. But even with that context in mind, I legitimately believe that there are ways to handle Perrin's storyline in particular in Towers of Midnight a lot better. Perrin's storyline is very whiplash-inducing at multiple points in the book because it's just kind of rough. You know, it takes until about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through the book, somewhere in like the 70% range, before Perrin's storyline is actually fully caught up with everybody else. And I don't think it needed to take like 70% of this book before Perrin was finally caught up with everybody else, considering that the first half of the book has a lot of story momentum from all the other major characters going on. I do think that some of Perrin's character arc, there's actually a little bit of his character arc with regards to the Wolf Dream in particular that probably could have been or should have been in The Gathering Storm instead. Towers of Midnight should have been like basically the entire first quarter of the book, like more or less only deal with Perrin for the first part of the book, just to get him caught up in that regard, to have some of that character arc stuff happen and then space it out so that it's effective from a character perspective. But there is some of the plot that happens in Perrin's character arc in the first half of the book that is really good, but again, like a lot of his personal character arc stuff just kind of happens too late, and some of it could have happened in The Gathering Storm in some spots. Like it's hard to really say here in this review because it's supposed to be more or less spoiler free. But what it really comes down to is that it should have been condensed a lot more within the first half of the book instead of waiting until the back half to have this big condensing of stuff happening. And then there's a lot of the story that is really great. Thank God for Sanderson knowing how to do something with Perrin, because Jordan didn't give him basically anything to go off of, because Jordan had no idea what to do with this character. That's why he did nothing for the last like 6 books. But the organization of Perrin's storyline in Towers of Midnight is super, super messy. The ugly of Towers of Midnight is that like you're going to have whiplash with this from a timeline perspective. Even going into it knowing that this was going to be a problem, there are many references between some plot lines that are just like, man, I don't even know when Perrin's storyline is happening in accordance to some of the others at this point. Like there are some references that like suggest when it's supposed to be happening, but because it's so off center from that moment, it's like, but is that really the reference that's being made, or is it trying to reference this other similar thing? I'm not entirely sure. And like this happens a lot in Perrin's storyline. Like I said, whiplash inducing, that is definitely a problem here. I literally cannot objectively give Towers of Midnight 5 stars, no matter how much I enjoyed all of the content of it, because the timeline gave me whiplash, and Perrin's storyline could have been handled better. Like, I read this book, and I can't look at it and say, I forgive it its timeline issues because of, the structure thing, because of what Sanderson was forced to do, the way that I can look at Gathering Storm and do that. In this case, it's like, no, even in the context of this book on its own, there's a lot of structural problems that could have been handled differently. The timeline issues in Towers of Midnight are such that if I were to go back and like hypothetically do like a re-edit, quote unquote, of the structure and stuff of Lord of Chaos through Knife of Dreams, basically, to turn the slog arc into 3 books instead of 5, because that's something that I would legitimately like kind of play around with just to soothe my brain. If I were to do something like that, I would also touch up Towers of Midnight a lot. I'd maybe even experiment with The Gathering Storm a little bit with regard to Perrin's storyline, and including at least a few of his scenes in there instead, just to try to make things line up a little bit better. But if nothing else, I would definitely be touching up this book as well, because it is kind of rough. So coming up into the recommendation, it is pretty clear that I don't love Towers of Midnight as much as The Gathering Storm. You know, as long as you understand that the timeline issues are there and you are very much braced for it, the content of the book is great, but it is definitely, like I have suggested, a good bit weaker than The Gathering Storm is. I do think it probably tops the 4 out of 5 star entries for me out of the series, just because the content that is here is really good, good enough to top the other 4 out of 5 stars for me. I do have a couple 4.5 star books that I have rounded up to 5, so those would rank above Towers of Midnight, but you know, that's neither here nor there. Of the straight up 4 out of 5 star books within the Wheel of Time, Towers of Midnight is at the top of those. So like, it's still really good, and I do think if you're braced enough for the fact that some of the timeline gets very, very strange in some places and very off-putting in some places as well, that you'll be fine. Like, you'll enjoy it, and you'll be able to survive. Like, it's not like it actively confuses some things, it's just, you know, jumping back and forth in the timeline in a couple of ways. It's like, I don't know that we needed to handle this way. I think it could have been handled better. So, you know, that's the thing. But in general, if you are excited, if you're kind of struggling with like book 11 or something, just like, okay, well, how well does Sanderson actually get us to the last battle? Because it feels like this sort of thing that's like on the horizon, but they're not actually doing anything about it. Towers of Midnight is the book where that side of things definitely ramps up a bit. The Gathering Storm does as well, but this book in particular is like, the last battle is basically starting, and makes it so that starting the next book is more or less an imperative. So yeah, that is where I sit with Towers of Midnight. This video, my review of this book, comes out on March 31st, and my first spoiler talk reading diary for A Memory of Light will come out here in just a couple of days on April 2nd. So I'm, you know, finally on the final stretch of the series. Nearly 3 years later, it feels good to be at this point. I'm excited to finish it up, and I hope to see you guys along for the ride with me as I finish up this journey. You know, there are some people who have been following along with my Wheel of Time journey for the last 3 years, which is kind of crazy to me. There's the fact that I've been doing booktube for only, 4 years and 3 months now. Maybe you could say 4.5 years if you count the few months before 2022 actually happened that I spent preparing for it. So yeah, I've been doing booktube for 4.5 years or less, and nearly 3 entire years of that time has been spent in some capacity with Wheel of Time. What a chapter of my life to be about to finish up here in about a month's time. So yeah, crazy. Anyway, that is the end of the review. Thank you for watching. Like I said, my first impressions video for A Memory of Light will be up in just a couple of days, so I hope you guys are excited for that, because I certainly am. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.